Helen unlocked the front door with the usual weight of the day still clinging to her shoulders. The late bus ride, the broken copier at the school, the lingering drizzle. Ordinary burdens. But as the door swung open, something shifted. The scent hit first. Fried onions, artificial vanilla, and something floral she couldn't place. Too loud, too sweet. Like a mall perfume sample exploded in her hallway. She hesitated at the threshold. The house felt off. The light in the entryway was on, but not how she'd left it. There were shoes on the mat, tiny pink ones, muddy at the toes. A jacket, not hers, hanging over the stair rail. Voices floated from the kitchen, but they weren't familiar. Then came the shriek of cartoon laughter and the blare of music from the living room. She took a step inside. The floor creaked under her damp flats. On the sofa, where her folded blanket used to rest, sat a little girl with jam-streaked cheeks and a tablet glowing in her lap. Crumbs clung to her t-shirt. A half-eaten slice of toast balanced precariously on the armrest. The child looked up, blinked once, then returned to the cartoon. Helen's eyes swept the room. The decorative pillow from her grandmother's chair lay on the floor, stained. Her rug was askew. Her air. The kitchen door swung open. A woman stood there, broad-shouldered, early 40s maybe, in sweatpants and a hoodie zipped too high. Her hair was cropped short, her face scrubbed clean and unapologetic. A stranger. "Oh, hey," the woman said, as if Helen had come in through the wrong door. "You must be Helen. I'm Sherry. We're just staying here for a bit. Your mother-in-law said it's fine." Helen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "She's my cousin on George's side," came another voice, softer, from behind. Georgia, her mother-in-law, stood near the fridge, arms crossed, her expression already defensive. "They got a plumbing mess back at their place. I figured it wouldn't be a problem." Helen still hadn't removed her coat. Her keys were still in her hand. The kitchen was bright with noise and clatter. Sherry moved easily, opening drawers, checking a cabinet. She whistled low. "You got a nice setup here. Cozy." She smiled like someone who'd been here for weeks. Helen felt it then. Not anger, not yet, but something looser. A drifting. Like the ground wasn't hers anymore. She caught herself staring at the cupboard handles. Had they always been this crooked? From upstairs came a thump and the unmistakable sound of someone dragging luggage. "Hope it's okay we took the upstairs room," Sherry added casually. "Didn't want to wake the kid on the couch." Helen blinked slowly, then turned her head toward Georgia. "We didn't talk about this." Georgia poured herself a glass of water, shrugged. "You're kind, Helen. I know you wouldn't leave a child out in the cold." Helen pressed her lips together. George wasn't home yet. She took her purse upstairs and found the guest room stripped bare. The closet door was open. A suitcase sat in the corner. On the bed, her grandmother's quilt had been replaced with a superhero comforter. She closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway listening. There were footsteps downstairs. Someone opened the fridge. The microwave beeped. The smell of buttered popcorn joined the rest. It wasn't the noise or the mess that unsettled her. It was the silence that used to live here. The stillness of lavender and old books, of her own rhythm. It was gone. Later that night, in bed, Helen stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, the little girl cried out and was hushed. A cupboard slammed. She could smell that perfume again, cloying, chemical, invasive. She rolled onto her side and reached for the nightstand drawer. Inside, beneath an old notepad and a photo of her grandmother smiling in the garden, lay a small vial of lavender oil. She uncapped it, just enough to inhale. For a moment, the house felt like hers again. Then footsteps returned, and the silence broke. Helen had stopped leaving her shoes on the welcome mat. It didn't feel like hers anymore. The mat was smeared with dried mud, cracker crumbs, and once a jelly bean that had melted into the fibers. The girl, Sherry's daughter Emma, had made herself comfortable in every room, including Helen's once sacred study. The upstairs bedroom, which used to house spare quilts and photo albums, now had the smell of overcooked soup and bubblegum. Toys crept down the stairs like invaders, plastic dolls with tangled hair, puzzle pieces with teeth marks. And on the third day, a man showed up. "Just my friend, Cal," Sherry had said, pouring coffee from Helen's carafe like she'd always lived there. "He's got nowhere to go for now. 2 nights max. Promise." Cal had the tired look of someone who never quite made it out of his 20s. He dropped a duffel bag by the coat rack, nodded once in Helen's direction, and disappeared upstairs. She found one of his socks in the laundry basket later. It wasn't clean. Georgia, as always, had said nothing about it directly, but Helen noticed that her hand lingered on Cal's arm a moment too long when she passed him the salt at dinner. George, her husband, ate in silence, his fork moving automatically. When Helen mentioned the overflowing trash or the missing bath towel, he would sigh and reach for his beer. "Their family," he muttered once. "It's not forever." But it was beginning to feel like it. The door to the upstairs room never closed completely now, always open just enough for voices to travel down the stairwell. Emma's screeches blended with the late-night thrum of the TV. The thump of footsteps echoed after midnight, and the faint scent of smoke, cigarettes, maybe more, crept under the door frames. One afternoon, Helen came home early and found Cal on the couch, shirtless, flipping through her mail. "Didn't know you were off today," he said without looking up. Her voice barely worked. "That's my personal mail." "Didn't open nothin'," he replied with a shrug, tossing the envelope back on the table. The floor creaked behind her. Emma ran past, her hands sticky with juice, and left a trail of purple fingerprints across the banister. Sherry's voice followed. "Emma, use a napkin, babe." But she never came to clean it. Later, while vacuuming, Helen noticed muddy shoe prints on the white rug in the living room. Not one pair, several. She stared at them, frozen. The vacuum hummed in her hand like a weapon she didn't know how to use. The rug had been a gift from her grandmother, brought back from a trip to Santa Fe. She remembered unrolling it on the day they moved in, how George had admired the pattern and called it classy. Now the colors were dim under the grime, and George didn't even glance at it anymore. That evening, Helen found herself retreating to the bathroom just to sit in silence. She closed the toilet lid and sat, hands in her lap, listening to the muffled sounds of other people living their lives through her walls. The laughter wasn't hers. The cooking smells weren't hers. Even the way the fridge hummed now felt different, louder, like it too had been claimed. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The lines near her mouth looked deeper, her eyes duller. Behind her, a bath towel hung crooked, not hers. She straightened it and left without drying her hands. At dinner, George complimented the casserole Sherry had made. Helen said nothing, not because she agreed, because she didn't know when the silence had started tasting easier than the fight. The box was tucked behind the linen stack, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Helen had forgotten it for years, buried it even. But something about the way Cal had sprawled across the couch that afternoon, tossing popcorn into his mouth and scratching his stomach like he paid rent, had shaken something loose in her memory. It came back in fragments. The sterile white of the hospice room, the way the sunlight filtered through slatted blinds and fell across her grandmother's hands, thin, translucent, veined like dried leaves. Helen had brought orange slices in a paperback she never read aloud. She didn't need to. They both knew time was thinning. Her grandmother had smiled that day, faint, tired. "You'll stand on your own 2 feet, won't you?" she'd whispered, voice papery but sure. "Whatever kind of man comes along, you'll have your roof." Helen had nodded, not fully understanding. "Top drawer of the old cedar chest," Grandma had said. "Under the crocheted runner. The papers are there. Yours. Quietly done." At the time, Helen had smiled through the tears, thinking it sweet. A gesture, a token. She hadn't told George. They were newly engaged. He talked about buying land one day, starting fresh. She didn't want to clip his wings with a dusty house full of antique furniture and floral curtains. But she had gone home, found the box, and tucked it deep into the hall closet behind winter sheets and beach towels. It had stayed there through 4 anniversaries. Now, Helen stood in that same hallway, heart tight, breath shallow. Her fingers found the soft cardboard edges and pulled. Inside, under brittle photo envelopes and yellowed receipts, were the legal documents, a notarized deed. Her name, printed clean and formal. Helen Marie Moore. The property at 114 Sycamore Lane, granted in full. No co-owners, no husband, just her. She sat on the floor, the hallway dim around her, and read each page slowly. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. Her grandmother's handwriting, in the margins of one note, read, "You hold the key. Don't forget." Helen exhaled, a long, ragged sound. She hadn't cried, not when the guests arrived, not when the rugs were ruined or the kitchen crowded with noise. But now her chest pulled tight. Not grief, something sharper, like a thread pulling through fabric. A mending. For the first time in weeks, she stood without hesitation. The papers went into a folder, then into her bag. She knew now what power she'd given away. Not stolen, just handed over, by default, by silence. Later that night, George asked if they could talk. She nodded, but didn't sit. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes darting. "Look, I know it's been a lot, but Sherry's family. Emma's just a kid. I thought maybe we could..." Helen opened her bag and pulled out the folder. She didn't hand it to him, just placed it on the counter between them. "I'm the owner of this house," she said softly. "Since before we married." George stared at the folder, didn't touch it. "You never said." "I didn't think I had to." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I'm not asking permission," she said. "Not anymore." She didn't wait for a reply. Upstairs, Sherry's laughter bounced off the walls, bright and oblivious. Cal's boots thudded across the floorboards. Helen stood in her kitchen, hand resting on the folder like a weight that finally belonged to her. Tomorrow, she thought, the conversation would begin. Tonight, she let herself remember who she was. The sun had barely started its descent when Helen pulled into the driveway earlier than usual. A schedule mix-up had cut her workday short, and for once, the thought of a quiet house felt like a small mercy. She didn't get that mercy. As she stepped onto the porch, the sound of voices slipped through the screen door. Not loud, just low enough to suggest privacy, an intimate tone reserved for conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. Helen paused, one hand still on the doorknob. The kitchen window was cracked open. She could hear the kettle whistling, the clink of a spoon in a mug, and then George's voice, measured and falsely sweet. "I just think we need to start thinking long-term," she said. "Emma's going to need stability, school enrollment, doctor's visits. These things go smoother when there's an address, a permanent one." "I thought it was just a couple weeks," George replied. He didn't sound convinced, just tired. "Well, sure, but you know how these things stretch, especially when there's mold involved. You've seen the bathroom pictures." Sherry's voice jumped in. It's black mold, George. Toxic. You want that around a kid? Helen's knuckles tightened around the doorknob. There was a pause, then a slurp. Someone sipping tea. I just worry, Georgia continued, that if something were to happen, if Helen ever got upset about all this, we'd have nothing to stand on. No rights, no proof of residency. Yeah, Sherry added. And then what? Back to sleeping in my car with a child? She's been real quiet lately. Too quiet. I don't trust that. She's not a fighter, Georgia said. Never has been. You know Helen. She avoids conflict. Always has. Another pause. Then Georgia's voice low. You think we should get Emma on the lease? Better, said Georgia. Get her on the documents. There's ways. If Emma's registered here, school, medical, mail, it's something. It's not full protection, but it's enough to raise questions later. Enough to make Helen think twice. And down the line, Sherry added, almost too casually, maybe we talk about a portion of the house, not the whole thing. Just enough to show we're invested. For the child, you know. The kettle stopped whistling. A chair scraped. Helen couldn't move. Her breath sat in her throat like a stone. They were talking about her home like it was a deal on the table, like it was up for discussion, like she wasn't even part of it. And George, her husband, hadn't said a single word in her defense. I just don't want to spook her, he muttered, if we come on too strong. Then don't, Georgia said smoothly. Ease her in. Talk to her as a husband, not as a lawyer. She respects that. Or at least, Sherry said with a soft snort, she used to. Helen stepped back from the door, careful not to let it creak. The voices blurred into background murmur, but the damage had already settled. She didn't need to hear another word. She climbed the stairs like sleepwalking, each step slower than the last. In the bedroom, she shut the door, then locked it for the first time since they moved in. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs vibrated through the walls. A child's laugh bubbled up from the living room. Helen sat on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, breath shallow. They were planning her out of her own life, not directly, not with threats. Worse, with assumptions, with strategy, with smiles. She stood abruptly, went to the closet, and pulled the deed from the folder again. Held it. Ran her thumb over her name. Solid. Inked. Real. Tomorrow, she thought again. But this time, it wasn't a delay. It was a promise. The clatter of forks and plates masked the tension in Helen's jaw. The table was full. Emma dipping her fingers into the mashed potatoes, Sherry swirling a glass of tea like it was wine, George staring at his plate as if it might offer him answers. Georgia laughed too loudly at a story no one cared about. Cal didn't speak at all. Helen had cooked the roast. She always did on Thursdays. The smell filled the house the way it used to, before the noise, before the shift. But tonight, it sat heavy, like a goodbye meal. She waited until Emma had giggled through her third spoonful of corn, until Cal had leaned back with a satisfied sigh, until Sherry had started asking about rearranging the guest room furniture. Then she placed her napkin on her lap and said, with a calm that surprised even her, I'll need you all to be out by Sunday. The silence was instant. Forks froze. Breaths caught. Even the child went still. Georgia recovered first. Out? Helen nodded. Yes. I'd like my house back. A nervous laugh from Sherry. Wait, are you being serious right now? Very. Hold on, George said, his voice strained. Can we maybe not spring this on everyone over dinner? I didn't spring anything, Helen said evenly. I waited. I've been waiting. She reached into the side drawer and placed the folder on the table like a judge with a final ruling. The deed peeked out just enough to show the letterhead. just enough to silence the room. "This house was left to me by my grandmother," she said. "Legally, solely mine." Sherry scoffed, pushing back from the table. "So that's what this is about? Some paper from 1,000,000 years ago?" Helen turned to her. "It's not just paper. It's what I've kept quiet about for far too long." George's voice softened, the kind of motherly tone that always made Helen feel small. "You're not thinking clearly. There's a child here. We're family." "No," Helen said, her voice cutting clean through the room. "You're guests, temporary guests who overstepped." Sherry stood now, arms crossed. "So what? You just expect us to pack up and leave? Like we're trash?" Helen looked at her without blinking. "Yes." "Jesus," Cal muttered. George finally stood too, but he didn't look at his wife. He looked at the deed. "I didn't know you had this." "You didn't ask." He rubbed his hands together, as if the friction might create a solution. "Helen, we can talk about this." "We're talking now." From the corner, Emma began to cry. Sherry moved to console her, but kept her eyes on Helen, glassy now with a mix of anger and performance. "You're really gonna do this? Kick out a kid?" "I'm kicking out grown adults who chose to stay when they weren't wanted." The tears came faster. Sherry's now, real or not. "I should have known. You never liked me." "That's true," Helen said, still calm. "George?" Sherry turned to him, desperate now. "You're really okay with this?" George looked between them, then down. "She's right," he said, barely above a whisper. Georgia pushed her chair back. "You'll regret this. One day, you'll look back and see what you lost." Helen stood. "Maybe, but tonight, I get to sleep in a house that's mine. That's enough." Cal muttered something under his breath, then left the table. The chairs scraped against the tile. The plates remained unfinished. No one looked her in the eye as they moved. At the front door, Helen watched them gather their things in silence. "You too," she said to George. "You knew. You stood by." He looked at her for a long moment, said nothing, then stepped out. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in weeks, there was silence. A silence that didn't ache. It settled like dust after a storm, still, steady, and hers. It was nearly dusk when the knock came. Helen had been trimming dead stems from her indoor plants, the quiet of the house interrupted only by the soft scratch of clippers and the ticking of the hallway clock. She didn't jump at the sound, just stood, wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, and walked to the front door. George stood on the porch. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence, as if the wind had worn him down in the last few days. In his hands, a cardboard box, old, stained at one corner with something that looked like motor oil. "Hey," he said. His voice was cautious, unarmed. Helen didn't answer. "I found this in Sherry's car," he went on, adjusting his grip on the box. "Tucked under the seat. I don't think she meant to bring it back." Helen stepped aside just enough for the porch light to catch his face. The weight of something unspoken settled between them. He lifted the box slightly. "It's yours. I think it always was." She took it without a word. Inside, her grandmother's mantel clock. The brass face dulled with fingerprints, but intact. A faint trace of lavender still clung to the velvet lining of its base. Helen's chest tightened, not with sadness, not exactly, but something older, something earned. George shifted his feet. "I wasn't strong. You needed me to be, and I—" She looked up. He stopped. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "You were always the brave one." Helen nodded once, then slowly, quietly closed the door. No slam, no final words, just the quiet click of wood meeting wood. The house absorbed the silence like breath. She carried the clock to the mantel, placed it where it belonged. Her fingers lingered on its frame. It ticked to life with a sound so soft it was almost a whisper. In the kitchen, she found the small jar, clear glass, label peeled off years ago, once filled with her grandmother's wild berry jam. Now, water. And a bundle of lavender, fresh from the Saturday market. She set it on the windowsill, just where the sun would catch it come morning. The scent was clean, calming. Outside, the porch light flickered on with the fall of night, but inside, everything was still. And for the first time in a long while, Helen felt no need to check the locks. She was home.